In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. There are things that every congregation does well, and things a congregation maybe struggles a bit more with. And it varies from place to place. For example, at St. John's, a traditional and careful approach to worship, where we try to bring our very best to God through prayer and music, this has long been an important part of who we are as a church. It's one of our strong points, I think. Where we struggle sometimes, maybe every now and then, is fully sustaining and staffing the ministries we start with great enthusiasm. We're a busy congregation given our size, and every now and then we have to work very hard to put out the call for help when there's an area that has wound up a bit short-staffed by volunteers. We're doing that right now, of course, trying to get extra help with a few more managers to run the Loving Spoonfuls meal ministry for the poor on Sunday afternoons and Wednesday evenings. We're also trying to get 2 or 3 more people to help with the nursery downstairs for parents with young children. And I'm sure we'll get what we need eventually. But I also know that keeping these kind of regular sustaining ministries that go on forever is kind of the point, sometimes requires multiple invitations to participate. But one of the things St. John's does do really well when it comes to helping is when there's a single immediate need that needs your response. For example, during the past several weeks of March, I have loved watching a cardboard box in the coat room fill with bag upon bag of children's underclothes and socks. One of our parishioners, Alicia Hager, put out word that there were poor children in Muskegon showing up to a clothes pantry who don't have enough underwear to wear. They only have maybe 2 or 3, turning them inside out so that they can get through the week. And underwear is not the sort of thing you generally get at a thrift shop or a clothing pantry, and so it's a need that's very hard to meet. Enter St. John's. Y'all donated a tremendous amount of underwear and socks to needy kids in our areas. Several of you also donated money to my discretionary account so we could purchase even more. Thank you for that. Thank you for this whole experience of you responding to a real need with such grace and generosity. Because one of the difficulties whenever you work with people who are struggling is often understanding what their needs actually are as opposed to the needs we think they have. After Alicia explained to us why it is that so many of these kids only have 2 or 3 pairs of underclothes, it probably made sense to many of us. We just never thought about what it must be like to live in that kind of situation. We needed someone to explain it to us because probably very few of us have ever experienced that kind of need. So many of us live relatively rooted lives, relatively secure jobs, not a lot to worry about what we eat or what we will wear from day to day. And so it's easy to forget that the way we live is different from the way that most people in this world live, that the way we live is even different from the way many people in our community live. So we need to be taught. We need to learn. Back when I was learning liturgical Spanish in seminary, one of the tasks was to memorize the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. And one of the phrases that always tripped me up a little was the one that says, "Give us this day our daily bread." In Spanish, it's "Danos hoy nuestro pan de cada día." It kind of rolls off your tongue after you've been doing it for about 2 years. "Danos hoy nuestro pan de cada día." It's such a theologically rich phrase. Give us this day our daily bread. It's a theologically rich phrase, but one whose import we often miss because we say it so often. We say it every time we come to Holy Communion, every time we have a home communion visit. Give us this day our daily bread. Notice in that prayer, we don't ask God to give us wealth or comfort, though that's probably what's on our mind much of the time. No, in the Lord's Prayer, we ask God to give us enough food for today. That line in the Lord's Prayer is a much more powerful line to people who live paycheck to paycheck, people who live hand to mouth. not quite sure where each day's food is going to come from. People who know what daily bread actually looks like. I think one of the reasons we, of course, say this prayer before Holy Communion is to remind us that this is, of course, the bread that sustains us at our deepest level, the bread of Holy Eucharist. And so we pray in the opening collect for today, acknowledging that Jesus is the true bread who gives life to the world, continuing, evermore give us this bread that he may live in us and we in him. But the purpose of that nourishment with the daily bread of the Blessed Sacrament is to enable us to nourish the world with the daily bread their bellies need. In the Hebrew Bible reading for today from the 5th chapter of Joshua, the people of Israel are about to undergo a pretty significant change in how they get their daily bread. For 40 years, they've been wandering in the wilderness, ever since their parents' generation arrived at the Promised Land and was too scared to enter it. During this long wandering over 40 years, the people of Israel have been fed by manna, small pieces of bread that appeared on the grass each morning like dew, along with quail that God would send into their camps. But at this moment in their life, most of their parents have died, along with the great prophet and leader Moses. They're the ones kind of in charge now, as odd as it feels when you suddenly realize that you're the one in charge now and not your parents, right? So they stand on the cusp of the Promised Land, and we're told that they ate the Passover meal once more, that sacred ritual meal which reminded them of God's salvation of their parents back in Egypt. And then we're told that the next day there was no longer any manna. Instead, for the first time, they ate the food of the Promised Land into which they had entered. This ancient story of the people of Israel entering the Promised Land in the book of Joshua is actually a retelling of that story. This book was probably written and compiled around the time that the people of Israel were languishing in exile, hundreds and hundreds of years later, long after their forefathers had come into the Promised Land. So the people hearing this story probably knew what a great success was going to happen in the next chapters of Joshua. They knew that as these chapters continued, that the people of Israel would indeed take and fill the land, making it their own, the land that God had given them. But the people in exile hearing this story in Joshua also knew what happened next. They knew the tremendous failure of God's people as God's people forgot to trust in God and began instead to trust in themselves over and over again, thinking they were the ones who'd accomplished it. They were the ones who'd enabled them to have what they had. The exiles hearing the story from Joshua know how over time the whole country became increasingly concerned with accumulating wealth for the few, particularly at the expense of the poor. You see, it's a wonderful blessing to live in the Promised Land. Absolutely. But as you and I know, when you live a life that is rich with blessings, it's also very easy to forget that your blessings were not manufactured by yourself. It's easy to forget that everything you have is a gift from God. When you live a comfortable life, we just all tend to think, oh, wow, look what I did. It's very easy to think that what you have is yours because of your own hard work, and to hoard it, to keep it from your neighbor who may be in need of finding daily bread. On the fourth Sunday in Lent, we've kind of turned a corner. Now we're more than halfway through our own Lenten wanderings in the wilderness. And I hope that as you've walked through this season of Lent, you've had some experiences of what it means to rely on God anew instead of on yourself. I hope you've experienced during Lent God's care and God's love for you in places that were dry and difficult in your life. I hope that God's love greeted you each morning like manna, like dew upon the grass, even if that dew may have been a little frosty from time to time. I hope that each Sunday, as you've come to worship, you've been fed with spiritual food and drink of Christ's body and blood in this communion bread. I hope that as you've experienced Lent, that you've heard God say to you, like he said to Joshua and the people of Israel so many centuries ago, today I've rolled away your disgrace and your sin. I hope you've experienced that love, that forgiveness. But I hope something else for you as well. I hope that your disciplines of fasting, whatever they've been, have helped you learn a little bit more what it means truly to rely on God to give you what you need each and every day. And if that hasn't been your experience in Lent, then the fact that we're only a little over halfway through is good news, because it means maybe you could try that for these last final weeks. Try some discipline of fasting, of not living such a life of comfort, so that you can remember that it is God who provides what you need, so that you can remember that all the things that you are used to, you don't actually need all those things. Because most of us, we do live very blessed lives, and it's easy to forget that everything we have, whether great or little, everything that we have flows from the abundance of God's love. It's easy to forget that you and I are called to give freely of everything we have, so that no one has to wonder where they will find their daily bread. Because in the end, the story in Joshua is the story of a community that was nourished by the miraculous manna, and of a community that will only be faithful if they seek that faithfulness together. If they know that they are indeed their brother and sister's keeper, if they know that when they eat the fat of the produce of the land, that they're called to ensure everyone gets to eat of the produce of the land. The sins and failures that follow in the story of the people of Israel were inevitably because the individual began to care more for herself or himself than for his brother and sister, for their neighbor. So I hope that you have a different experience. And likewise, when you and I pray the Lord's Prayer, notice that we don't ask God, give me today my daily bread. Dame mi pan de cada día. No, we say, give us today our daily bread. This prayer is a corporate request, one we make in solidarity with all our sisters and brothers, our neighbors, our fellow humans. Give us as a community, as a human body, our daily bread. And the wilderness of Lent should remind us of that. It should remind us that when any human is lacking in daily bread, it's not because God has not provided. Rather, when any human lacks in daily bread, it's because you and I have held on to what we have as though it were our own. Reminds me of another of my favorite prayers, one I learned when I was living with the community in the Isle of Iona, at the Abbey there. Lord, to those who hunger, give bread. And to those who have bread, give the hunger for justice. Because we have forgotten, like the people of Israel, I fear. We've forgotten that what we have for the good of all, for the good of the entire community, of each and every human, that what we have is not ours to dole out as we see fit, as though we are some kind of grand benefactor. But what we have has been entrusted to us ever so briefly, as God invites us to ensure, to look around us and ensure that every person has what they need for today. And that if they don't, we know it's our job to give up what we have so that every belly can be filled every